Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. In just a moment, we are going to start the funeral services. We'd like the family to see everybody, so we're going to ask the family to please be seated as people walk by and let them acknowledge your presence. We welcome those of you who are joining us online, but please come forward and let the family acknowledge your presence. Folks, if you just want to walk by the family, let them acknowledge your presence here. Ladies and gentlemen, once you've seen the family, we do ask that we limit the conversation just to create it's more of a sacred mood. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time we are going to start the funeral services. We want everyone to have an opportunity to see the family. Rabbi Jeffrey Weil will be officiating. I'd like to ask everyone to please take a moment to be sure that your phones have been turned off. And the rabbi and the family performed the ancient ceremony of Kriya a few moments ago.
Birth is a beginning, and death is a destination. But life is a journey, a going, a growing from stage to stage. From childhood to maturity, from youth to age, from innocence to awareness, and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion, and then perhaps to wisdom. From weakness to strength, or strength to weakness, and often back again. From health to sickness, and back, we pray, to health again. From offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude, from pain to compassion, and grief to understanding, from fear to faith, and from defeat to defeat, until looking backward or ahead, we see that victory lies not at some high place along the way, but in having made the journey, stage by stage, a sacred pilgrimage. Birth is a beginning, death a destination, but life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage made stage by stage, from birth to death to life everlasting. Friends, we gather today to honor the journey of Fred Holubow. What a journey it was. I continue with words that are familiar lines from the book of Ecclesiastes. L'kol zman ve'et l'kol chefetz tachat hashamayim. For everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot that which is planted, a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, a time when we must refrain from our embraces, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear, a time to sow, a time for silence and a time to speak. Today, we have many who wanted to speak. Words of memory, tribute of honor of Fred Holubow. It's my honor to offer these words and then to call up several people who will follow me. Right now at services and throughout the week, we read through through the 5 books of Moses a little bit every week. And we're nearing the end of the book of Genesis. We're reading the story of Joseph. Joseph, that most, in my opinion, the most impressive figure in Jewish literature. Joseph the dreamer. He was a dreamer, yes, and he was a keen interpreter of dreams. And he was a brilliant statesman, a politician, a crafter of economic policy. He was the doted upon son who united a family. But most importantly, he was a man who lived with, I would say, conspicuous and unimpeachable integrity, honesty. Quite a number of achievements for one man. Fred Holubow's achievements were no less varied and impressive. He possessed expertise in so many areas, well beyond his profession, which itself was extraordinary and impressive. He developed a plethora of skills and interests and knowledge, pretty much, also to quote Ecclesiastes, pretty much everything under the sun. He was a man about whom others would remark, is there anything he doesn't know? And like Joseph, Fred lived with steadfast integrity. We live in a world in which people often seek to skirt ethical borders. Fred did not. He walked with integrity, and most importantly, he was the heart of this wonderful family, and his family resided in the depths of his heart. Fred was the son of Geraldine and Harry, They lived in Humboldt Park. He was an only child, often on his own. This offered him the space, the ability as a child to cultivate his intellect. His father encouraged him to read whatever he wanted to read, whatever interested him, and a lot interested him. And he pursued these interests intellectually at the library and in other ways too. One day, 8-year-old Fred, without telling anyone, took public transportation on his own to the Museum of Science and Industry. That's intellectual curiosity. Grew up, he became a graduate of von Steuben, and he pursued his higher education, studying electrical engineering at MIT, and then finance and master's at the University of Chicago. One evening, I believe he was living in Hyde Park, a young woman elsewhere in the city gave her number to a very persistent coworker. It was an older Jewish woman who wanted to set up this young woman. And she finally gave her number. And through a chain of transmission, that phone number ended up in the hands of Fred. He looked at the number, he recognized the number, he called the number. Sandy answered. "Why," Fred asked, "are you giving your number to little old ladies?" The fact is, Fred and Sandy had already been dating. They had already known each other. When a few little old ladies randomly set up two young people who are already dating, it signifies that there is order in this universe, that they were meant for each other, that it was beshert, this relationship and this marriage. Sandy, artist, philosophy major, wasn't sure about dating an engineer, but she said he was, and she meant this as a compliment, the most unusual guy. Fred asked to see her portfolio early, maybe perhaps their first date. That is a very good idea when you're dating. He later said that he wanted to marry an artist, and that's a young man who really knows what he wants. They started dating in August. Sandy was smitten by October, and they married. During the early years of their marriage, Fred was deeply invested, and that is a pun, in his career. But when his sons, Mark and Eric, reached their preteens, Fred, as a father, really hit his stride. He loved relating to his sons in more mature ways so they can talk and have conversations about what interested all of them. They would talk about their interests, they would fish together, they'd do photography, or he'd counsel them in photography. And when Fred had an 800 number, this allowed Mark and Eric to call their dad from wherever they might be, and they called him a lot. They talked a lot. And I imagine during these conversations, they might have laughed a lot too, because laughter has been a hallmark of this family, a Holubow hallmark. Dinner table conversations back in the day consisted of a succession of one-liners, everyone eager to come up with something funny to say. Fred was also an entertaining storyteller. Sandy referred to her husband as a raconteur with no cruelty, which is a great phrase. And I think it's also critical to understanding who this man was. His humor was not of the cheap variety that sought to insult or deride others or degrade others. No, he and they, the family, simply found humor in life, in this world, and there's a lot to laugh about. We must find humor in it. And so he was funny and he was jovial, despite the weight of really significant professional responsibilities. His professional achievements were impressive and significant. Many people, clients and colleagues as well, I'm sure, depended on, for very important matters, on his judgment and his leadership and his expertise. It is a heavy weight for one to bear. But Fred did maintain his joviality and his humor. Humor, of course, is an aspect of intelligence. And I know you don't need me to remind you that intelligence was something that Fred Holubow possessed in abundant supply. He had such a dynamic mind. It led to his immersion in geography, home building, medicine. He crafted model ships. He built computers. He was an award-winning photographer, an expert cultivator of orchids and tender of bonsai, many of which are held at the Chicago Botanic Gardens. So much. This is just a smattering of all of that. His broad interests really were the mark of a true Renaissance man. And it also led him to leadership positions and generous support of esteemed Chicago institutions like the Symphony, Botanic Gardens, the Art Institute, University of Chicago, WTTW, and yes, Paws too, for he was a friend to shadow the cats. Fred was also a patron of, really connoisseur of sophisticated gastronomical restaurants, notably the world-famous Alinea. And he himself was, and really is there no end to what he did. I've come to understand the depth and the breadth of his talents. He himself was a great chef. Sandy, or as he called her, his beloved Sandra, was the day-to-day meal maker for the family. But one day a year, New Year's Eve, Fred swooped in to prepare elaborate repasts, sumptuous multi-course meals. He did it for those he loved dearly. And speaking of those he loved, there were many, as we can see here and online too. There were two very dear friends, in particular Tom and George, both of whom passed away close to each other and much too young. And it is painful to lose friends too early, for sure. Fred, of course, loved this family dearly. Sandy, his wife, or Sandra, as he called you, for 57 years of marriage, of whose career as an artist he was proudly supportive. He was a very proud father to Mark and Eric, and he and Sandra embraced the expanding family. Stacy and Kelly, Alisar, and the grandchildren Noah, Sydney, Eleanor, and Miriam, who loved your hapa. Years ago, Fred, who, not surprisingly, had a dark room in the house, presented his sons at different times with cameras. It's a profound gesture, actually. A father's cameras in the hands of his sons. It captures something about the man and about that relationship. Fred did not merely instruct them how to take pictures. It was more than that throughout life. He taught them, as he taught many, how to keep things in focus, to see things clearly in a blurry world at times, to zoom in on what matters. Fred taught so many of you, all of you, particularly this family, how to live well, to see the humor, to indulge in life's greatest gifts, to live with honor, to love. That example offers no better lens through which to view life and this world. May Fred Holubow's life and lessons long endure, and Zichrono Livracha, may his memory always be for blessing. Amen. It's my honor first to call forward colleague and friend Jerry Kahn, a colleague at Standard Shares. Watch your step at the end.
I first started to work for Irving Harris in 1973. At that time, there was a separate building, an office, right down the hall, which contained the people working for Standard Shares, which the Harris family owned, and that's where I met Fred. That was a long time ago, and I'm never expected to outlive him because he was younger than I am. I always loved his sense of humor, and he always had a joke, and I really enjoyed that. I remember a long time ago, someone in our office who's here today, Victor Morgenstern, and Fred, when options first came out, they said it was inefficient and they could make some money for a while. And I was able to, at their request, to join just financially because I didn't know anything about it, and it was very successful. And I knew at that time that both of them were very smart, and I always respected Fred's intellect. I knew him as a very good stock picker, particularly in banks, which he did very well with, and I learned a lot myself and did well with banks. But he also knew a lot about science and biotech, and we made a lot of good investments as a result of his study. I remember when we first got computers, Fred came to my office and helped me with the computer because I didn't know what I was doing. And the same thing got repeated when we got the iPhones. He always seemed to understand it and taught me an awful lot, and I always appreciated it. I remember when he came to I was in the office one day. His office was like right next door to mine, and he was packing up and told me that unfortunately he had contracted a disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, and the doctor said he probably had 5 years to live. Well, unfortunately, he didn't make the 5 years. And I'm still here, but I'm always appreciative of knowing him. And see Sandy here. She once came to my office. I knew she liked art, so I gave her a mug, an impressionist mug. I think she still has it. And that was my pleasure. And I want to say hello to the family. I hope you're doing as well as can be expected. I know you know that you are the product of a really great man, and I appreciate the opportunity to say hello. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry Kahn. Another friend and colleague just mentioned his name, Victor Morgenstern.
Hello, I'm Victor Morgenstern in person. Thank you for those kind words, Jerry. Fred was one of the most interesting, intelligent, and enjoyable people that I've ever met in my life. Fred and I started out as neophytes in the investment business together back in probably 1969 or 1970, so just a little less than you've been married, Sandy, but I feel like he was somebody that I was exceptionally close to. The sense of loss was really profound. When I found that Fred had passed, it was almost like losing a friend that you had grown up with, even though Fred and I didn't meet each other until we were late 20s and 30. The fact that we were these young neophytes working under Irving Harris, who actually I think we both saw as mentors, meant that we really matured together. We also matured together because our families got close. Irving was very generous, and we were able to spend several summers up in the Lake Lakeshore Fishing Club in Lake Coudray. Mention was made of Fred as a fisherman, and Fred was not only a fisherman, but like everything he approached, he was a student of fishing. So we would go out on the lake, and he would tell me everything about the substructure because he had studied the topography. He told me everything about the water temperature, everything about the correct bait to use, and I would tell him what we should drink that night and how and how much of Nora's fried bread we should eat. It was really quite a delight. One of the anecdotes I'd like to share with you is my first meeting with Fred, which really set the stage for how close we would become. It was one of the early meetings that we both attended in the Harris offices, where Irving would invite people to come in and discuss their businesses and investments. And during the meeting, I noticed Fred was sitting next to me, and I noticed that he was wearing a gold ring. And I noticed that on that gold ring there was a picture of an animal. There was an inscription of an animal on it. My eyesight was much better, and I finally saw that it was an MIT ring. Now, Fred was an electrical engineer. My undergraduate degree was chemical engineering. I was an IIT grad. And so shortly after the meeting, I went up to Fred and I said, "Fred," I said, "I see you went to the IIT of the East Coast." To which point he laughed a little bit, and I said, I saw there was a picture of an animal on that ring. What was it? What is that animal? He says, "Oh, it's a beaver." I said, "A beaver?" He said, "Yeah." And then he paused for a minute and he turned to me and he said, "We build things." And I immediately retorted, "Well, I'll be damned." That set the stage for Fred and I and the repartee that we enjoyed well over 50 years. Fred and I were also co-investors with each other. In the early days, we were colleagues. We worked together in Irving's office for a period of probably around 4 years. When Irving gave us, the group of us, the opportunity, Steve Hirsch, Ralph Wanger, and a group of other folks to break out of the family office and set up our own investment shop. Irving was advised by lawyers that he had too many conflicts and should exit that. And so each of us had to make up their mind whether to remain in the office with Irving or leave and set up shop on our own. And unfortunately, it turned out to be fortunately for all of us, because everybody did well, Fred decided to stay with the office, as did several of the other fellows, and a group of us decided to leave and set up shop. The good news was that even though we split apart, we continued to office together for many, many decades. Irving and his staff stayed in our offices, either right in the offices or close to us. And so Fred and I were able to continue our relationship, not as colleagues, but really as co-investment partners. We started a partnership called Holubow Partners that was very successful. Not every investment made money. There was a particular oil business and movie that never got produced, and that continued basically to this day. Just within the past 18 months, Fred and I co-invested in a small medical startup at a Brown University that we hoped could really be an advancement in neuroscience. So Fred continued to be active all through his life, which was really a model that I cherish dearly. In thinking about what I was going to say today, one of the things I thought about is, what would Fred say? And I immediately downloaded the Chat GPT app, because Fred was always right at the cutting edge of things, to see what I could find. And after several queries back and forth and questions and comments, I stopped to think about it, and I realized that if I had to describe Fred, I'd probably describe him as a mashup of Charlie Munger and Norman Lear. Charlie Munger, of course, was one of the most revered investment people, being a partner of Warren Buffett, and he was always admired for his wisdom and his directness, and Fred was a very direct person. Norman Lear, on the other hand, was a very, very creative person, terrific sense of humor, but would really be, his humor was really a comment on the human condition, and Fred was just loved to make comments like that. And so I decided Chat GPT could only go so far and really couldn't express, the real emotion that I felt about the man. One of the things that I started laughing to myself about was, I think Fred would enjoy being called an effer. What's an effer, you might say? Well, to me, an effer is somebody who has a love of family, felines. We talked about Shadow, and I have another comment on that. Finance, flora, his orchids and his bonsai, fugues, the symphony, especially J.S. Bach fugues, fishing, which we've mentioned, fast cars, he loved his Tesla, and he was very farcical and frugal. And the farcical and frugal brings to mind a very interesting story that Fred told me. Fred would do things like, go on airline trips where he would go back and forth and really not stop over just to keep his pass going. But Fred was also, this is the days before cell phone, when it was very important to have telephone listings for landlines. And Fred found out that if you wanted an unlisted line, you'd have to pay a little bit extra. And Fred said, I'll be damned if I'm going to give the telephone company any more money. And so what he did was he listed the line in the name of his cat. His cat's name was Bruiser. And so there was a Mr. A. Bruiser listed in the telephone directory. And Fred used to delight in telling me that every once in a while Mr. Bruiser would get an unsolicited call. And one day it was the Arthur Murray Dance Studios asking for whether Mr. Bruiser would like to take dance lessons. And of course, Fred immediately remarked, well, he's taking a cat nap now, and besides, he's very light on his feet, so I really don't think he'd be interested. That was the kind of humor that Fred brought to the table. He was really the most enjoyable friend to be around and cohort. I always was jealous of the fact that Fred could sit in the room and, with his humor, ask the most direct questions of people and elicit the responses that I would be afraid to ask. And it was really a gift that I've not seen anybody else had. I will sorely miss Fred. I hope that, Sandra, we can stay good friends. And Mark and Eric, I know, I've seen your work, and I want to know how to mine Bitcoins. Yes. Clearly, he'll be very missed. May his memory be a blessing to all of us.
Thank you, Victor. The fact that you came up with all those, I hesitate to say those F words, shows you did not need ChatGPT for wonderful remarks, so thank you. Call forward now dear friend of Fred and Sandy, Paul Kitsalis. It's Paul, here he is.
I know no one here except for Sandy and her sons. I really consider this an honor that you've asked me to say a few words about Fred. I do have some prepared remarks. It certainly won't be as long as what others have said, but this is how I remember Fred. It's technology. It's titled The Fred I Knew. Yeah, every now and then, as one goes through life, you meet an exceptional person. Fred was one of those people. I met Fred later in life, about a decade ago. I knew nothing about his accomplishments, what these other gentlemen had spoken about. Nothing. Everything about him I learned later. And I met him through Sandy, who had known my wife, Maureen, at the Old Town Triangle Association. And we would visit once in a while. We go to Fred and Sandy's house. And what I remember is Fred was always a very welcoming person. I could see him now. He'd come out into the reception area, the hallway, and he always had his red suspenders and a belt on. But what I really liked about Fred was he always had a big, broad smile on his face, and his eyes were always twinkling. He was like a small Santa Claus because it's that time of the year. But he was just so happy to see us, and that made us feel good. Someone else mentioned that he does everything so well. He was an excellent cook. But now my experience with Fred cooking at his house is not only did he make wonderful meals, he explained each part of the meal, including the tools he used. So it was like this giant science experiment for me, just watching him. He'd pull something out of the drawer, say, look, this gadget does this does this. There was bells, there was whistles. And it was like at the end of the day, you put this beautiful meal on the table. Yep. Technology, again, I think we need Fred. One moment, please. And as other people said, Fred was a polymath. He was wise. He was very wise, and he could speak at depth on many subjects. Everybody knows this. But I didn't know this. And I could converse with him for hours at a time, and did. We just sat at the kitchen table, and the time would just go very, very, very quickly. And I always walked away saying to myself, I learned something new again from him. Even at my age, I said, wow, this guy's smart. He loved and embraced technology and was always eager to show and explain his latest gadgets. And this was great, all well and good when sitting in his house. So my one story is, however, once when driving us on the Kennedy Expressway, chatting away about the wonders of his new Porsche, he said, look, I'm taking my hands off the wheels. Which he did, and the steering wheel, and Maureen and I were sitting in the back seat, like just looking at each other. He goes, no, it's good. It works. And then there was the Tesla, and there's be way too many stories to tell you about the Tesla. But again, he liked to show everybody all the gadgets, sitting in his garage. He goes, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be this way. Fred was also very generous. There were many years when I was traveling back and forth on business to Mexico City, like every week. And Sandy and Fred would invite Maureen out for dinner with them. And Fred always insisted on picking up the tab. That was very, very nice. Some additional things I'd like to say about Fred. He was very, very convincing. He had a very special relationship with a cat. He liked Chinese food a lot, and he drove way too fast. I mean, to summarize a relationship and a person's life with a few words is difficult. I saw him last on November 27th, and despite his ailments, he carried on and was engaging as always. And I did not think it would be the last time that I would see him. It has been a privilege to have known Fred and to consider him a friend. And I will close by saying what his friends, family, and other people whose life he has touched know. Fred will be remembered as a mensch, a good, kind, and thoughtful person. He will be sorely missed. Again, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Paul. Dear friend Kathy Jacku.
I will be brief. No, I have to be. I only have 2 pages. As I was thinking about what I wanted to say about my friend Fred, I was sitting and discussing it with my daughter, who has known Fred her whole life. And we hit upon the particular joie de vivre that Fred had and shared with the world. We all know and recognize Fred's terrific humor and brilliant mind, but what set Fred apart was his exuberance. It was that devilish twinkle in his eye when he was about to tell an outrageous joke and that raucous laugh that brought others into his orbit. We all felt that. He not only enjoyed life and culture to the fullest, but he had a profound ability to bring others along on the journey. There are countless ways that Fred's friendship enriched my life. He introduced me to Japanese cuisine, especially sushi, long before there were sushi trays available at the Jewel. Most of us hadn't really heard about it. Fred was an expert. Through Fred, I learned about the art of bonsai and had the privilege of touring an exhibit at the Botanic Gardens with him, where his submission had the blue ribbon. Very impressive. I could come to him with questions on medical issues, technology, and finance, and he would take the time to explain complex concepts in ways that I could understand. There are many different kinds of geniuses, but it's rare to find a person as brilliant as Fred who also has the patience and ability to share their insight in a way that's accessible. He was that kind of genius. I remember one occasion when I got to witness Fred's softer side. After 9/11, I stopped over to visit Fred and Sandy, and playing on the stereo was a musical compilation that Fred had put together of the Battle Hymn of many versions of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, from pop singers, I think even Elvis, and choral groups. We were all so raw at that time, and it was Fred's way of expressing the shared suffering of our nation. Today, we sit in a different kind of shared loss as we collectively grieve the passing of our dear friend, husband, father, and grandfather. Fred touched the world in many ways, and he will be missed. I am so grateful to have known him. After I got this together and printed out my remarks, I checked my phone, and the stock market had closed. The Dow had closed at record highs. I'm not sure, but I'm giving Fred the credit. Thank you.
Thank you for all those wonderful remarks, friends. Now it's my honor to call forward first son, Mark.
My father was the smartest person that I've known. As a kid growing up, I would ask him all kinds of questions about the world, like why is the sky blue? How do magnets work? How does electricity work? He always knew the answer and could explain with great intricacy the finer concepts and details that were a lot more than I asked for or could comprehend as a young 6-year-old. Patiently teaching small children was not a strong skill of his. Nonetheless, his insight was impressive and formative for me. My father was a voracious reader, sitting at his Eames lounge chair and ottoman, consuming the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Investor's Business Daily, Science News, Cranes, and a host of other publications for pleasure and for work. He would watch the news and various science, political, and financial shows on PBS and the major networks. He had a lot of diverse interests and hobbies throughout his life and was knowledgeable of a great number of subjects. He loved science, technology, chess, the Chicago Bears, traveling, fishing, gardening, gourmet cooking, theater, and fine dining. He was an audiophile. In the past, he would sometimes listen to the police radio, and more recently, he would be up to date with the latest traffic and weather apps. My father graduated from MIT with a degree in electrical engineering, and he proudly wore his Beaver class ring his entire life. Although he went on to graduate from the University of Chicago with an MBA and enjoyed a successful career in finance and investing, he was at heart an engineer, like his father. When I was growing up, my father used to buy and build different electronics kits. Most were games housed in plastic project boxes with LEDs, switches, and push buttons that he would let me play with. He even built a digital clock that had an analog face and a pendulum that swung that was made of red LEDs that hung on the wall in our living room. In the late 1970s, he would go to hobby shops and meetups and buy and build early home computers, way before they became mainstream. He taught me how to load and play games from an audio cassette on our Apple II computer, like Sink the Ship, Apple 21, and Gunslinger. My father was an early adopter of many consumer electronics, digital watches, VCRs, CD players, for example. He had a car that would tell you that a door was ajar. It would talk to you. He would buy the latest models, and I would get his hand-me-downs, and I was grateful for all kinds of gadgets that were new to me and new to my generation at the time. My parents took me to see the movie War Games in the theater when it was released in 1983, and I was 12. For those of you who might not be familiar with the movie, young Matthew Broderick brings the country to the brink of nuclear war just trying to play a game. I had never heard of a modem and was asking my dad all about it after the movie. He told me that his home computer had one, and when we got home, he showed me how to dial up a computer bulletin board system that night, and that became a big hobby of mine throughout high school when I ran my own bulletin board system. This was all pre-internet stuff. My father's experience and his passion for technology and the novel toys and equipment that he brought home and surrounded me with no doubt contributed to my love and passion for science, technology, building and fixing things, my choices of study, and my career in software development. I pride myself on being an engineer like my father and his father before him. So finally, I just want to say thank you, Dad, for being able to answer all of my questions as a child, for exposing me to your technological interests and hobbies that eventually became mine, for offering me guidance and advice when I was in college, and for always being there as an adult, as my confidant and my advisor. I love you, and I will miss your wisdom, advice, your great intelligence, and wit.
Thank you, Mark. Son Eric.
Let me organize myself. I'm going to start off by sharing some things about my dad you may know, and some things you may not, in the hopes you may be able to see my dad through my eyes and see him for the titan he was. Fred was the consummate gourmet. Whenever we traveled, the meals were the first things decided on the itinerary, with everything else being planned around it. We never lived an especially lavish life, but fine dining was the only exception. Once we learned that Grant Achat's new restaurant, Alinea, which was eventually awarded 3 Michelin stars, was opening up down the street, it became an immediate priority for Fred. He promptly secured a reservation within the first week of its opening. But in a freak stroke of good fortune, I became the first in the family to dine there, having been invited by a graduate school professor of mine who had another in his party drop out. When I mentioned my lucky invitation, this was perhaps the first and only time in my life I saw my dad exhibit the slightest signs of jealousy, albeit still good-natured, good-hearted in nature. Having just finished graduate school, and a few weeks away from starting my first job, I asked if he'd be willing to help pay for my meal, which was $350 a person at the time. He promptly replied with the timing and delivery of a stand-up comedian, "No, but I highly approve." After his first meal at Alinea, it instantly became his favorite restaurant. Whenever there was a reason to celebrate, whether a birthday or anniversary, we went there. At one stretch, we went 5 or 6 times in a year. Fred was never one to deny himself pleasure. During this time, Fred and Sandy formed an especially close relationship with Grant, eventually becoming regulars to friends and family nights. Upon the news of Fred's death, I let Grant know the terrible news. And I just want to read his response, which I found quite poignant. "Your father was someone we appreciate so much. I'm not normally a social person with guests, but he was someone I connected with. His honesty, humor, and savvy was something I really respected. I remember the first time I went into the dining room to say hi after several visits, and he criticized a beef dish that I knew when it left the kitchen wasn't right. I smiled, we made eye contact in a way that made everything fine. In an instant, he understood my job was hard, and I loved the fact that he wasn't a yes man. We were always excited to have him and your mom in, and someone I always wanted to make sure was looked after. Please let us know how we can support in any way." And for those of you who are thinking what I was hoping, sadly, Grant did not offer to provide free catering for Shiva, though I highly approve. In reflecting on the type of person Fred was, the term Renaissance man is often mentioned. Accounts of his various passions and endeavors have no doubt been shared at length up to this point, but I did want to share a personal story that I think captures how his various passions translated into his relationships. Fred's pursuits weren't entirely self-serving in nature. They were a means, a vehicle for bonding with others. His knack for sharing one's passion and amplifying it with his own fervor was that like a mirror neuron, firing instantly when he observed an interest in another. This was the magic of my father. He was genuinely enthusiastic about your interests because they were often his as well. A great example of this was when I entered graduate school at IIT's Institute of Design. There I spent a year doing intensive design studio work in industrial design, graphic design, photography, and videography. And when I entered the program, I was required a digital camera. He gave me his Olympus digital camera, a high-end model, which at the time boasted a whopping 3.5 megapixels. And when he put the camera in my hand, it actually reignited his dormant passion for photography. When I began learning how to print at school, he got himself a color printer and began printing at home. When I would frame and exhibit my work, he too began to have shows of his own again. He and I would eventually travel the world, going on photo shoots together from Florida to Maine and all the way to Tokyo. My love of photography was not only supported and sparked by him, but it was truly shared. So while my mother would like to take most of the credit for my artistic talents, Fred too is equally deserving of fanning that flame within me. Fred was a humble and understated man that wasn't one to talk about himself. He was reserved about his interests and accomplishments, some just learning about him as they met him. Instead, he let his accomplishments speak for themselves. That's probably why it wasn't until I was in design school that I gained a full appreciation for his love of modern design, because that's when I realized I was living in the MoMA, surrounded by pieces from modern design masters like Mies van der Rohe, Isamu Noguchi, and Philippe Starck. Plus, who could forget Fred's signature piece of furniture, his Ray and Charles Eames lounger? That iconic piece that is forever intertwined with his own identity. Who here can honestly say they don't think of Fred whenever they see one? And while he has since replaced the one he purchased over 60 years ago, I'm proud to report that the original number 564, is still a part of our family and residing in my home. Recently, I came across an interesting series of graphs that show the proportion of time one spends with various people over the course of their lifetime. The time you spend with coworkers spikes in your early 20s and remains consistently high into your 60s. Same goes with your partner, though growing and extending further into your later years. When it comes to Fred and children, this chart is particularly insightful. Friends make up a big part of one's life in the early and middle years and steadily drops the older people get, the more time being spent alone. When it comes to children, they spend the vast majority of their life with their parents until their early 20s, and then it drops off like a cliff. An obvious but no less painful reality is parents become empty nesters. This chart in particular was a startling wake-up call for me, because it showed just how precious and fleeting these early years are with my children. But I reflected on that chart and what it meant to me as a child, and how little time I had left with my own parents. After this revelation, I was resolute on bending the curve. Thankfully, I chose to remain in the city to raise my family. No judgments to those fortunate enough to have raised their kids in the idyllic suburbs. I had my own reasons, but being close to my parents who remained in my childhood home was nonetheless a blessing. It afforded me the opportunity to see my parents as often as I could. Besides taking the occasional symphony or nice meal out with Fred, I made sure to pop in to see my parents several times a week, most often stopping in for ice cream before my girls' dance class or enjoying a morning cup of coffee with Fred after dropping them off to school. Only now can I truly appreciate how precious those seemingly mundane times were. And while one can never have enough time with a loved one, I'm especially devastated for my children who had known him the shortest. And while tragic to know that much of what my children will know of my father are from others' experiences, much of his memory will remain in them, because I see so much of him within them. Eleanor is like a master tinkerer and inventor who channels Fred's ability to immerse herself in her passions, going down the proverbial rabbit hole, finding such joy in the pursuit. And Miriam is my analyst, the one who asks the profound questions and seeking out the answers. And I'm proud to report she's already developing that devilish sense of humor. Fred has lived such a rich and generous life, touching the lives of so many here. And while he has left an indelible impact on the world, I'm confident that his spirit will live on for many years in whomever had the good fortune to cross his path. I love you, Dad.
Thank you so much, Eric and Mark. Beautiful, touching remarks about your father. My honor to call forward granddaughter Sydney.
No, I'm an emotional person, so just warning you. Sometimes goodbye is a painful way to say I love you. I will miss my dear grandfather, Hapa, every day. His laugh was contagious, and he always gave the best hugs. Not only did he love his family, but he let them know how proud he was of us all. From a young age, my grandfather inspired me. I look up to him as a role model, and he supported me in any way I could. I'm so thankful for all the moments we shared and all the wonderful memories you left with us. Your life was an example of strength, courage, compassion, and generosity of spirit. A fond memory I reflect on would be our time together in Boston. My grandfather, father, and I went to visit colleges in March of 2018, and although the trip was short, the memories were long-lasting. Hapa truly showed how much he cared about me and my future, and he was proud that I wanted to become an engineer like him. Every step along the way, whether it meant reading my college essays, deciding what school to choose, or what classes to take, he was there. Every semester, he would print out my course schedule and tell me how proud he was of me, following in his footsteps. You have touched so many lives with your wisdom and wit. Your guidance, patience, and support were a blessing in our lives. Hapa's kindness and love will stay with us forever. We will love you and miss you always. I love you, Hapa.
Thank you, Sydney. Beautiful. It's my pleasure to call forward Sandy.
I am not going to speak about Fred because I was too close to him. I don't want to do that. Most of you had seen us together. You know that we were very close. You know that we were very compatible, and we truly enjoyed each other. So what I'm going to tell you about is that last night I was trying to clear my desk for the Shiva, and I found the message machine flashing. I had not seen it, the message machine. I had so many stacks of papers and whatever. But a very special friend of Fred's reached out to me with his memories of their shared past. They met at the Booth Business School at the University of Chicago in Roman Wiles' Operation Research class while getting their MBA. After graduation, their paths would periodically cross, but business and family responsibilities meant they were seldom in the same place at the same time. Nevertheless, they maintained their close relationship through phone calls and emails over the years. Fred and Ross Nicholson shared a quirky sense of humor, a love of fast cars, good food, and of course, the world of finance. They also shared friends such as Jim Laurie, George Stigler, and Tom Polanski. We last saw Ross and his wife Shirley about 4 years ago when we visited Asheville, North Carolina, where they were living. A highlight of that trip was spending time together while Fred and I attended Asheville's Festival of Jewish Food. I'm sure most of you have never heard of that festival, but we went. I know Ross wanted to be here today to say goodbye himself, but I can't thank him enough for sharing his memories of a beautiful friendship. I also, before we close, I wanted to say thank you to Arlene Shafton, who helped do the research for the obituary. And I also want to thank Arabelle Shippers, who helped prepare me for today. I also want to thank all of you for coming today. Fred was a rare individual, someone we will not forget for a long time, certainly not me. 57 years married. And I think the greatest compliment he ever paid me, people would say, what did he get you for your anniversary? Where did you go? And actually, we didn't really exchange gifts. But the greatest gift he gave me one year was to say to me, you know, I'd marry you all over again. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sandy. Into your care, O God, we entrust the spirit of Fred Holubow, for you keep faith with your children in death as in life. Sustain all of us, O God, that we may meet with serenity the mysteries that lie ahead for us, knowing that when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you, God, are with us, as a loving friend in whom we put our trust. You are the light of our lives and our hope in eternity. We rise, if it is comfortable for you to do so, for the memorial prayer, the El Malei Rachamim. Mourner's Kaddish will be said at graveside. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Ametzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, Im Kedoshim U'Tohorim, Kezohar Rakia Masirim, Et Nishmat Yakar Shalanu Shalach Le'olamo. Baal Rachamim Yastirehu, Beset Kenafav Le'olamim, V'yitzur B'tzur HaChaim Et Nishmato. Adonai Hunachalato V'yanuach B'Shalom, Al Mishkavo, and no more harm. Amen. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence with the holy and the pure who shine like the glow of your heavens to Fred Holubow, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in your eternal presence and within the shadow of your wings. Let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And we say, Amen. You may be seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, the interment service will continue at Memorial Park Cemetery, located at 9900 Grosse Point Road here in Skokie. The family will be returning to the residence at 1844 North Hudson Avenue in Chicago. They'll be together Saturday night from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., and then Sunday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. Memorial contributions to Paws Chicago would be appreciated. Till 9 p.m. on Sunday from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. So for those of you who are online, we'll have the website updated from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. For those who are here, please know it is till 9 p.m. For those of you who will be driving in the funeral procession to the cemetery, the procession will be forming in the parking lot. Please obtain an orange safety funeral sticker to place on the right-hand side of your windshield. Have your bright lights and hazard lights on at all times. For additional measures of safety, we will be providing a car in the back of the procession to hopefully keep other cars from entering the procession. Please use your horn liberally as you're going through the intersection. Please do not speak or text on your cellular phone while driving to the cemetery. At this time, I'd like to call upon those who have been asked to serve as pallbearers to come forward, to please come to Fred's casket, and please rise as we escort him, the family, and the rabbi from the chapel. Then you may return to your cars. For those of you who are joining us online, this concludes the online version.